Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an immense movement of people forever changed the course of history. More than 12 million men, women, and children were taken from their homes in Africa and carried across the ocean to the Americas. This journey, filled with hardship and loss, was not just a passage across water, it was the beginning of centuries of struggle, survival, and resilience. Imagine villages suddenly altered, families torn apart, and entire communities reshaped by forces beyond their control. For many, life as they knew it ended in a single moment, replaced by an uncertain future. Ships would sail from European ports, loaded with goods to trade on the African coast. There, human lives became part of a global system that valued profit over humanity. Each voyage carried with it countless untold stories, stories of pain, endurance, and the fight to hold on to identity. On board these vessels, conditions were unimaginably harsh. People were confined to narrow spaces, with little room to move or breathe. The air was heavy, the sea was unforgiving, and disease spread quickly. Many did not survive the voyage. Yet even in the darkest circumstances, there were sparks of resistance and hope. Some sought freedom in acts of defiance, others in quiet determination to preserve their culture, language, and spirit. When the ships reached the shores of the Americas, the lives of survivors were transformed once again. They were forced into labor on plantations, in mines, and in households. Their work became the backbone of growing economies, yet their own humanity was denied. Despite this, their strength shaped the cultural, social, and political landscapes of entire nations. Music, traditions, and resilience carried across generations became lasting testaments to their will to endure. This vast and tragic chapter of history is not only about suffering, it is also about survival, resistance, and the unbreakable spirit of millions of people. The legacy of these journeys remains with us today. It lives in the culture we celebrate, the struggles we continue to confront, and the call to remember those whose lives were forever changed. By revisiting this story, we honor those voices that were silenced and recognize the resilience that continues to inspire. This is a reminder that history is not just dates and numbers, it is human lives, emotions, and lessons we cannot afford to forget. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover more hidden histories, bringing light to the stories that shaped our world. Together, we can keep these memories alive and ensure that the past is never erased. In the heart of Africa centuries ago, countless communities lived by rivers, across vast plains, and within dense forests. Families built homes from clay and timber, children played under the sun, and elders passed down stories by the fire. Life was not without its struggles, but people grew crops, traded goods, and celebrated festivals that tied them to their ancestors. It was a world of rhythm, tradition, and deep connection to the land. But this world began to shift when distant forces discovered the wealth and strength that could be drawn from it. Foreign ships appeared on the coasts, bringing strange goods, metal tools, cloth, weapons, and alcohol. These items were tempting for rulers and warriors seeking to gain power, protect their territories, or outmatch their rivals. The arrival of these goods began to change the balance of power across regions, creating an opening for a tragic exchange. Conflict had always existed in some form, but with new incentives, raids and wars became more frequent. Leaders who once measured wealth in cattle, gold, or land now found value in something far more devastating: human lives. Rivals struck villages under the cover of night, not just to claim land or resources but to take people. The captured were marched for miles, bound together, stripped from everything they knew. For some, betrayal came even closer to home. Neighbors or local leaders saw an opportunity to trade with the foreign merchants, exchanging their own people for goods that promised status and strength. Imagine the fear of a parent seeing their child torn away, the confusion of a young man dragged from his village, the heartbreak of an elder left behind as generations were fractured. These were not random events but patterns repeated across vast stretches of land. The people taken represented not just individuals but the collapse of traditions, songs, and knowledge that had flourished for centuries. When captives reached the coast, they entered a new world of uncertainty. Forts and trading posts dotted the shoreline, built by Europeans who rarely ventured inland but waited patiently for their human cargo. Here, long lines of men, women, and children were presented, inspected, and bargained over. The clink of coins, the exchange of weapons, the signing of contracts, all of it decided the fate of countless lives. The people were no longer seen as members of families or communities, but as part of a transaction. Yet, within this darkness, there were countless acts of resilience. People whispered to each other in their native languages, clung to memories of home, and sought small ways to hold on to their identities. Some resisted, fighting back against capture, refusing to submit to the traders' demands. Others carried songs and rituals in their hearts, determined that, no matter what lay ahead, their culture would not be erased. The partnership between European traders and local powers created a devastating cycle. European ships brought goods to African shores, goods that fueled further conflict and made it easier for local rulers to capture more people. In return, the ships carried their human cargo across the sea to the Americas, where the captives would be forced into a new life of labor. This system reshaped entire continents. Villages in Africa were left empty, kingdoms rose and fell depending on their involvement in the trade, and across the ocean, new societies were built upon the toil of those who had been taken. The story of capture and trade is not just about economics or politics, it is about the breaking of families, the silencing of songs, and the courage of people who endured the unimaginable. It is about how power and greed reached into the heart of communities, turning neighbor against neighbor and forever changing the destiny of millions. Centuries later, the echoes of these events still resonate. The scars left by those raids and betrayals remind us of the fragility of trust and the consequences of valuing power over humanity. But they also remind us of resilience, because from the ashes of those broken villages, from the pain of those stolen generations, came strength, survival, and voices that refused to be silenced. This chapter of history is heavy, but it is also a call to remember. It urges us to look back not with despair alone, but with respect for those who endured, those who resisted, and those who passed down fragments of culture that survive to this day. Their story deserves to be told, not as a footnote in history, but as a central part of the human journey, a reminder of both our capacity for harm and our unyielding ability to endure. Far out on the open ocean, where the horizon seemed endless and the waves struck with relentless rhythm, began a journey that would shape the destiny of millions. This crossing, known in history as the Middle Passage, was not just a route carved on maps but an experience of unimaginable endurance and sorrow. It was a voyage that connected continents, yet tore apart lives. For those forced onto the ships, the sea itself became an enemy. The Atlantic stretched vast and merciless, days blending into nights as storms rolled in without warning. The creaking of wooden planks, the crash of waves, and the cries of the wind filled the air. To those on board, time seemed to lose meaning. Each sunrise was a reminder of distance from home, each sunset a deepening sense of the unknown. The journey was long, often lasting weeks or even months. The ships sailed westward, leaving behind the coasts of Africa and heading toward lands unseen by most of those carried within them. Each mile farther across the sea was another mile away from familiar rivers, villages, and traditions. The ocean was both a physical and symbolic divide, cutting people away from everything they had once known. Life on these vessels was harsh and unforgiving. The decks above bustled with the activity of sailors, but below was a different reality. Here, people endured conditions that stripped them of comfort and dignity. They were crowded into confined spaces with little room to move, the air heavy and suffocating. Food and fresh water were scarce, and illnesses spread with alarming speed. The smell of salt and sickness clung to every corner. The sea itself offered no mercy. Storms could toss the ship like a toy, waves crashing against its sides, threatening to splinter it apart. Lightning lit the sky, thunder roared, and those inside could only wait, powerless against nature's fury. Even on calm days, the endless expanse of water weighed heavily on the spirit. There was no land in sight, no escape, only water stretching endlessly in all directions. Yet, in the midst of despair, there were quiet acts of resilience. People whispered to one another, shared fragments of songs, or prayed in the silence of their own hearts. Some looked to the stars, recognizing constellations that had guided their ancestors, seeking comfort in the idea that the same sky stretched over the homes they had left behind. These small acts, invisible to the world, were powerful declarations of humanity. The Middle Passage was not only a physical journey but also an emotional and psychological trial. Fear of the unknown hung over everyone. Where were they being taken? What awaited them at the end of the sea? For many, the lack of answers was as painful as the voyage itself. It was a crossing into uncertainty, into a future that could not be imagined. The voyage also served as a reminder of the scale of the system at work. Ship after ship made the same crossing, carrying thousands across the Atlantic. Each vessel represented countless broken families, countless silenced voices. The Middle Passage was not a single story but a collection of millions, each person carrying memories of home, each person forced into a journey that would alter the course of their life. Still, even in these darkest chapters, the human spirit proved unbreakable. Though many would never return to their homeland, the memories and traditions they carried endured. Songs, rhythms, languages, and beliefs survived the crossing, carried like hidden treasures across the waves. These fragments of identity became seeds planted in new soil, growing into cultures that continue to shape the world today. The Middle Passage is remembered not only for its hardship but also for the resilience it revealed. It showed how people, stripped of almost everything, still found ways to endure, to hope, and to preserve the essence of who they were. The ocean, vast and unforgiving, became the stage for one of history's greatest tragedies and one of humanity's most powerful testimonies of survival. As we look back, the Middle Passage demands more than remembrance, it demands understanding. It reminds us that behind every statistic lies a story, behind every voyage lies countless lives forever changed. To remember the crossing is to honor those who endured it, to ensure that their voices, though once silenced, continue to echo across time. This journey across the Atlantic was not simply about distance traveled on a map. It was about lives uprooted, cultures disrupted, and humanity tested to its limits. And yet, within the sorrow of that passage, we find a testament to strength, courage, and the will to survive even the harshest storms. The ships that crossed the Atlantic carried more than sails, timber, and cargo, they carried the weight of human lives under conditions that defy imagination. Deep within their wooden hulls, far from sunlight and fresh air, thousands of men, women, and children endured an existence designed with no regard for comfort or dignity. What awaited them on board was not simply a journey across an ocean, but a trial of endurance unlike any other. Below deck, space was the most precious thing of all, and it was nearly non-existent. People were pressed together so tightly that turning or stretching was nearly impossible. The wooden planks beneath them were rough, and the air was thick with heat, dampness, and the smell of the sea mixed with sickness. Ventilation was scarce, and every breath felt heavy, as though the very atmosphere conspired against survival. Chains were not just metal restraints, they were symbols of complete control. Ankles and wrists bore the marks of iron, and movement was dictated by the will of others. The clinking of metal became part of the soundtrack of the voyage, a constant reminder that freedom was not their own. Day after day, the weight of those chains pressed down as heavily on the spirit as they did on the body. Food was minimal, often little more than what was necessary to keep people alive. Water was rationed with care, but never in amounts that could truly satisfy thirst. Illness spread quickly in such confined conditions, and without proper care, even the smallest ailment became dangerous. The environment was unforgiving, and the lack of basic needs only deepened the sense of despair. Yet even in such harsh surroundings, there were flashes of humanity that could not be extinguished. Whispered conversations, quiet prayers, and shared memories traveled through the darkened space. Parents tried to comfort children, elders offered words of encouragement, and friends leaned on one another for strength. These small gestures carried enormous power, reminding everyone that they were more than the conditions forced upon them. Above deck, the world carried on with the rhythm of the sea, the sails adjusted, the ship creaked, and the waves rolled endlessly. But below, time seemed to stand still. Each day blended into the next, marked only by the faint light that sometimes filtered through small cracks or by the sounds of footsteps overhead. For those trapped inside, the concept of day and night blurred into a continuous cycle of waiting and enduring. The journey demanded immense strength, not just physically but mentally. To survive meant to hold on to fragments of hope, hope for an eventual end to the voyage, hope for reunion with loved ones, or hope that life, in some form, could continue despite the hardships. It was a kind of resilience that spoke to the depth of the human spirit, the refusal to surrender completely even in the face of overwhelming adversity. There were those who resisted in subtle ways, preserving songs, rhythms, and traditions in their minds. A melody hummed softly in the darkness became a connection to home, a reminder of identity that no chain could erase. Others found strength in silence, in the determination not to let their captors define who they were within. Every ship that sailed carried these stories, stories of endurance, suffering, and resistance. Though the conditions sought to strip people of dignity, the will to endure persisted. The cramped spaces, the iron restraints, the deprivation of basic needs, all of these became part of a shared ordeal that bound people together in ways their captors could never fully comprehend. Looking back, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what those voyages represented. The conditions on those ships were more than uncomfortable, they were a test of human limits. And yet, they also reveal something profound, that even in the darkest spaces, the human spirit has the capacity to hold on, to remember, and to survive. The ships eventually reached their destinations, but the memory of those journeys lingered in every life that endured them. The scars, both seen and unseen, became part of a legacy that would echo for generations. These memories serve as a testament, not only to the cruelty of the conditions, but also to the resilience of those who lived through them. In telling these stories, we recognize the strength of individuals who endured conditions designed to break them. Their survival was not just a matter of chance, it was a statement of willpower, endurance, and humanity that continues to resonate today. The ocean has always been a place of mystery, danger, and discovery. For some, it was a pathway to adventure and fortune. But for millions of Africans forced onto ships bound for distant shores, the ocean became a graveyard. The journey across the Atlantic was not only long and brutal, it was deadly. For every group of people who stepped onto those vessels, many would never live to see land again. Death traveled with the ships like an uninvited passenger. It crept into the cramped lower decks, where hundreds of bodies were pressed together with little air to breathe. Disease spread like wildfire in such conditions. A single cough could echo into a fever, and a fever could sweep through entire rows of captives. With no medical care, even treatable illnesses became fatal. Dysentery, smallpox, and fevers claimed lives silently, day after day, until the sound of suffering became as constant as the crash of the waves outside. Food was scarce, and what was provided often lacked the nourishment needed to keep people alive on such a grueling journey. Hunger gnawed endlessly, leaving bodies weak and unable to resist illness. Water, too, was rationed, and in the heat of the ship's hold, thirst could feel unbearable. Malnutrition weakened even the strongest, and exhaustion became a constant companion. Then there was the treatment itself. The journey was not one of care but of control. People were handled not as human beings but as cargo, and cruelty often replaced compassion. Punishments, neglect, and violence added yet another layer of danger to lives already hanging by a thread. Every day, some would not wake up, their bodies too worn down by the combined weight of disease, hunger, and hardship. Historians estimate that between 15 and 20% of those forced onto ships died before ever reaching the Americas. To put that in perspective, for every 100 people taken from their homes, as many as 20 never saw land again. That means that out of the more than 12 million people forced onto those voyages, nearly 2 million perished at sea. The scale of loss is staggering, an entire population erased in the silence of the ocean. Imagine the toll this took, not just on those who died but also on those who survived. Every death was witnessed by those still chained beside them. Families were separated forever, and friends lost one another in the shadows of the ship's hold. The ocean claimed more than bodies, it claimed connections, communities, and futures. Survivors carried with them not only the trauma of what they endured, but also the grief of those they had lost along the way. And yet, within this story of immense tragedy, there was also resilience. Many held on to hope even in the face of overwhelming loss. They whispered prayers, sang songs, or simply endured in silence, refusing to let despair consume them. To survive such a voyage was not merely chance, it was an act of unimaginable strength. The ocean became both a witness and a participant in this chapter of history. Beneath its surface rest the memories of countless lives cut short, reminders of the true cost of these journeys. The waves that once carried those ships now carry the weight of history, silent but enduring. When we reflect on the mortality rates of these voyages, we are not simply reciting numbers. We are acknowledging millions of stories, of children who never grew up, of parents who never saw their families again, of communities torn apart before they reached a new world. These were lives filled with potential, talents, and dreams that the world never had the chance to see. Today, the memory of those who perished at sea calls on us to remember not only the suffering but also the strength of those who endured. Their story is one of loss, but also of survival that ensured future generations would carry on, tell their stories, and honor their lives. The high mortality rates of the voyage remind us of the fragility of life in the face of cruelty, but they also remind us of resilience. Those who survived bore the burden of remembrance, and through their endurance, they gave voice to those who could not speak for themselves. The Atlantic, vast and unyielding, still holds these echoes. And as we retell their stories, we ensure that the lives lost are not forgotten, that their suffering is not erased, and that their resilience continues to inspire. This is not only history, it is a legacy of strength in the face of unimaginable adversity. When the long and brutal ocean voyage finally ended, the survivors stepped onto unfamiliar shores. Behind them lay weeks of hardship, loss, and despair. Ahead of them was a world that would use their strength, their skills, and their endurance to build wealth for others. For those who survived the crossing, the end of the journey was not freedom, it was the beginning of another struggle. Across the Americas, economies were growing rapidly, driven by the demand for labor. The fertile lands of the Caribbean and the southern regions of North and South America offered rich soil for crops like sugar, coffee, tobacco, and later cotton. These crops required an immense workforce to cultivate, harvest, and process. Mines in South America, rich with gold and silver, demanded endless labor to extract wealth buried deep in the earth. And in towns and cities, households needed workers to serve and maintain the lives of those who profited from this system. The survivors of the Middle Passage were seen as the answer to this demand. Markets were established where men, women, and even children were brought before buyers. They were inspected, their strength measured, their health judged. In these moments, individuals who had endured so much were reduced to what their bodies could provide. The survivors, though living and breathing, were treated as resources to be distributed across plantations, mines, and households. On the vast plantations, the work was relentless. The tropical sun blazed down as fields stretched endlessly across the horizon. The cultivation of sugar, in particular, required long hours of backbreaking labor. Cutting cane was not only physically exhausting but also dangerous, with sharp stalks and heavy tools leaving countless injuries. The rhythm of labor was dictated not by the seasons of nature, but by the unyielding demands of production and profit. In the mines, the conditions were no less harsh. Descending into the earth meant enduring suffocating heat, darkness, and constant danger. Workers extracted valuable minerals that fueled the wealth of empires, but they themselves rarely saw any benefit from their labor. The mines consumed bodies quickly, draining strength and leaving many broken long before their time. In households, survivors found themselves in a different kind of service. Cooking, cleaning, caring for children, and maintaining estates were tasks that required skill and constant attention. While the setting may have been less physically punishing than the fields or mines, it was no less demanding. Here, too, lives were controlled, and freedom was denied. What made this system so powerful, and so devastating, was its ability to fuel economic growth on a massive scale. The labor of survivors built fortunes that shaped nations. European markets thrived on the goods produced, and the wealth generated helped finance industrial expansion, global trade, and political power. The sugar that sweetened tea, the tobacco that filled pipes, the cotton that clothed millions, all bore the invisible imprint of those who worked to produce them under relentless conditions. Yet within this story of labor and exploitation lies another truth: survival itself was an act of defiance. Despite the immense challenges, survivors carried with them traditions, songs, stories, and knowledge from their homelands. On plantations, in mining camps, and in households, they formed new communities, shared wisdom, and found ways to preserve their identity. The resilience of these individuals became the foundation for future generations, who would continue to resist, adapt, and create culture out of hardship. Every crop harvested, every mineral mined, every task completed was a reminder of both the suffering endured and the strength shown. Though their labor was used to fuel economies, their endurance was something that could not be taken away. In time, their presence reshaped the Americas, not only through the wealth they generated for others but through the cultural legacies they left behind. Music, language, food, and traditions born in struggle would later transform the societies they were forced into, ensuring that their influence reached far beyond the fields, the mines, and the households where they once labored. The story of these survivors is not only about economic systems or global trade. It is about human lives, about endurance, loss, and resilience. The wealth of nations was built on their backs, but the memory of their strength is what endures today. By understanding how their labor fueled growth, we also acknowledge how their spirit reshaped history, leaving a legacy that cannot be measured in gold, sugar, or cotton. Their journey did not end on the shorelines of the Americas. It continued in the sweat of the fields, the dust of the mines, and the quiet strength of household service. And through it all, they carried forward a resilience that time has not erased. Their endurance is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, human spirit and survival have the power to shape the course of history. Across the vast oceans of the early modern world, ships carved repeating routes that tied 3 continents together. These voyages were not random, they formed a carefully constructed system, one that would alter the course of history. Known today as the triangular trade, it was a cycle of exchange that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a relentless circuit of goods, wealth, and human lives. Imagine a ship leaving a European port. Its hull was packed not with people but with products, textiles woven in workshops, barrels of alcohol, crafted goods, and, above all, weapons. These items represented more than trade, they were tools of power. As the ship sailed southward and crossed to the African coast, its cargo became currency. The goods were offered to rulers, merchants, and intermediaries along the shoreline, exchanged for the most tragic cargo of all, people. On the African coast, this trade ignited complex and often devastating dynamics. Local leaders, seeking to strengthen their own positions, accepted European goods in return for captives taken through conflict, raids, or deals with neighboring groups. Firearms in particular changed the balance of power, fueling cycles of warfare that created even more captives for future voyages. Thus, the trade was self-perpetuating. Europe supplied weapons that encouraged wars, wars produced more captives, and those captives filled the ships bound across the ocean. The second leg of the journey carried the most weight, both literally and symbolically. Ships now crowded with men, women, and children turned westward across the Atlantic. This crossing, known as the Middle Passage, became infamous for its brutality. Survivors of the voyage arrived in the Americas where demand for labor was insatiable. Plantations, mines, and households awaited their toil. Upon arrival, those who had endured the crossing were sold into a life of work that would fuel the prosperity of the colonies and, by extension, enrich the nations of Europe. But the triangle did not end there. The third leg of the journey carried back to Europe the products of labor extracted in the Americas: sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee, and precious metals. These goods transformed European economies and lifestyles. Sugar sweetened tea in English parlors, tobacco filled the pipes of gentlemen, cotton was spun into cloth for markets around the world, and gold and silver bolstered national treasuries. Each item was a visible sign of invisible suffering, the wealth of empires built on the forced labor of millions. The triangular trade was not just an economic system, it was an engine that reshaped societies on 3 continents. In Europe, ports grew wealthy, merchants flourished, and industries expanded. Cities like Liverpool, Nantes, and Lisbon owed much of their prosperity to this system. In Africa, the trade disrupted traditional communities, fueled violence, and caused demographic shifts that would have lasting consequences for generations. In the Americas, entire economies were structured around plantations and mines, embedding inequality into the very foundations of society. What made the triangular trade so powerful was its efficiency. No ship sailed empty. Each leg of the journey carried valuable cargo, ensuring profit at every stage. Goods from Europe, people from Africa, and resources from the Americas created a cycle that was as profitable as it was destructive. This efficiency made the system durable, persisting for centuries despite its human toll. Yet within this cycle of exploitation, the resilience of those caught in its grip cannot be ignored. Survivors of the trade brought with them knowledge, traditions, and culture that would profoundly influence the Americas. Music, food, spiritual practices, and languages carried across the ocean endured and adapted, shaping the identity of new societies even as the system tried to erase individuality. The triangular trade left behind more than wealth and goods, it left a legacy that still echoes today. Its routes carved into maps were more than lines of commerce, they were pathways of suffering, survival, and transformation. By binding Europe, Africa, and the Americas together, it created connections that were both destructive and lasting. To understand the triangular trade is to see how global history was built on cycles of exchange that valued profit over humanity. It is also to recognize the endurance of those who lived through it, whose strength ensured that their voices, though silenced at the time, would resonate through history. The system may have been designed for commerce, but its legacy is written in the stories of those who endured its journey, and in the lasting impact it had on 3 continents that remain connected by its history. In every chapter of history where people were denied their freedom, there has also been resistance. The story of Africans taken across the ocean is no different. Though forced into unimaginable hardship, they refused to surrender their spirit. Resistance took many forms, some bold and explosive, others quiet but enduring. Together, these acts remind us that even in the harshest conditions, the will to fight back and preserve identity can never be extinguished. On plantations across the Americas, revolt was the most dramatic form of resistance. Stories passed down through generations tell of groups who rose up against their captors, sometimes in the dead of night, other times in broad daylight. These uprisings, though often met with brutal force, sent a clear message: people would not simply accept oppression without a fight. In colonies like Haiti, such resistance eventually ignited revolutions that changed the course of history, proving that determination and unity could overturn even the most entrenched systems. Not every act of resistance involved open battle. Many chose more subtle methods, using everyday actions to undermine the system. Sabotage became a powerful weapon. Tools would mysteriously break, crops might be ruined, and work slowed to a crawl. These acts may have seemed small in isolation, but together they disrupted the profits of those who depended on endless labor. In this way, survival itself became an act of quiet defiance. There were also escapes. Some fled plantations to seek freedom in remote forests, swamps, or mountains, where they formed communities known as maroon societies. These hidden settlements became sanctuaries of independence, living proof that escape was possible. Though life was harsh in these secret villages, they offered something priceless: the chance to live free, even if only beyond the edges of the world controlled by others. Perhaps the most enduring form of resistance, however, was cultural survival. Torn from their homes, stripped of familiar surroundings, Africans carried with them traditions that could not be taken away. Music became a language of resilience. Rhythms of drums, clapping, and song preserved histories and stories, while also offering strength in the face of despair. Spiritual practices, too, were adapted and maintained, blending with new influences but always holding on to core beliefs that gave meaning and hope. Foodways, crafts, and storytelling also played a role. Seeds and knowledge of agriculture traveled across the ocean, shaping the cuisine of the Americas in ways still visible today. Folk tales, passed from one generation to the next, became a way of keeping alive the wisdom of ancestors while teaching lessons of courage and survival. Even names and languages, though often suppressed, found ways to endure through expressions, nicknames, and oral traditions. For children born into this new world, cultural traditions became a lifeline, connecting them to a heritage they had never seen but could still feel. Elders shared stories around fires, taught songs, and explained the values of community and kinship. These practices preserved identity against efforts to erase it, ensuring that generations to come would carry forward the memory of where they came from. Resistance was not only about fighting against injustice, it was about holding on to humanity in a system that tried to strip it away. Each revolt, each broken tool, each song sung in secret carried within it the same message: we are still here. We will not be erased. Over time, the accumulation of these acts reshaped societies. Revolts inspired others, sabotage chipped away at control, escapes created zones of freedom, and cultural traditions enriched the very lands that sought to suppress them. In fact, much of the music, food, and spiritual life of the Americas today bears the imprint of these traditions, testifying to their survival. The resilience of enslaved Africans reminds us that resistance does not always look the same. Sometimes it is loud and fiery, other times it is quiet and patient. Both forms matter, and both ensured that even in the darkest of times, hope endured. The story of resistance is not just about what was opposed, but about what was protected: family bonds, cultural identity, and the simple right to be human. These were victories not always recorded in ledgers or official histories, but they lived on in the strength of communities that refused to be broken. To look back at these acts is to see courage in its purest form. It is to recognize that even when stripped of freedom, people found ways to fight back and hold on to the essence of who they were. Resistance ensured that their legacy would not be silence, but a chorus that continues to echo through history. When we trace the path of the transatlantic trade, it is tempting to focus only on the ships, the ports, and the exchange of goods. Yet the most profound consequences were not in the ledgers of merchants or the vaults of European treasuries, they were in the lives of people and the societies left behind. The scars of this trade stretched across generations, altering Africa, the Americas, and the wider world in ways that still echo today. In Africa, entire communities were reshaped. For centuries, villages that once thrived on farming, trade, and kinship networks were torn apart by raids and warfare. Young men and women, the very lifeblood of future generations, were captured and carried away. This loss created deep voids. Fields once worked with care lay neglected, economies weakened, and populations dwindled. Some regions lost a staggering portion of their people, leaving behind not only empty homes but also broken social structures. The loss was not just numerical, it was cultural, emotional, and spiritual. Imagine a mother who watched her child taken, a village elder who saw the youth vanish, a community that suddenly found itself without the next generation to inherit its traditions. Stories, songs, and knowledge that should have been passed down were interrupted, leaving gaps in cultural memory. These absences spread like ripples, affecting not only those who lived through the raids but also those born long after, who grew up in worlds where entire lineages had been erased. The disruption of culture was one of the most devastating effects. Africa is home to countless languages, traditions, and spiritual practices. Many of these were threatened or lost as communities fractured. People carried fragments of their heritage across the ocean, but at home, the continuity of rituals and practices was broken. Some traditions survived only in pieces, while others disappeared altogether, leaving an irreplaceable silence in the cultural landscape. The trauma of the trade did not end with those who experienced it directly. It stretched across generations. Survivors carried memories of violence, loss, and displacement, passing down stories marked by pain. Children grew up in households where grief was a constant presence, shaping their identities and their sense of the world. In this way, trauma became inherited, not in the blood, but in the stories, silences, and struggles that defined family life. Across the Atlantic, the legacy was equally heavy. Enslaved Africans and their descendants built societies in the Americas, but they did so while carrying the weight of loss. Their presence enriched cultures through music, language, food, and resilience, yet the trauma of disconnection remained. Families separated on the shores of Africa were never reunited, and generations grew up with only fragments of their ancestral past. Even after the formal end of the trade, its consequences lingered. African nations that had been destabilized by centuries of raids and population loss faced challenges in rebuilding. Many regions fell prey to colonization, their weakened structures making them vulnerable to new forms of exploitation. The cycle of disruption, once set in motion, proved difficult to break. The damage was not only local but global. Europe's wealth and industrial rise were fueled by the profits of this trade, while Africa was left scarred and depleted. The imbalance shaped global power for centuries, creating inequalities that are still visible today. To understand modern disparities is, in part, to understand how this trade drained resources and lives from one continent to enrich another. And yet, alongside this story of damage, there is also one of survival. Despite depopulation, despite cultural disruption, African traditions found ways to endure. Music, religion, and oral histories carried across the ocean became seeds that grew in new soil, blending with other influences to create vibrant new cultures. In Africa itself, traditions adapted and evolved, preserving identity even through the storm of history. Still, the trauma is undeniable. To this day, the memory of those lost, the silence of broken lineages, and the echoes of disrupted traditions remind us of the scale of what was taken. Generational trauma is not just a historical concept, it is a lived reality, seen in the struggles of communities still working to heal and reclaim their heritage. The lasting damage of the trade cannot be measured only in numbers. It must be seen in the empty places where communities once thrived, in the stories cut short, and in the resilience of those who carried on. It is a reminder that history is not only about what happened in the past, it is about how those events continue to shape the present. The triangular sails of ships may be gone, but the triangular wounds remain, in Africa's loss of people, in the Americas' inherited struggles, and in the global inequalities that still exist today. By telling this story, we honor those who endured and acknowledge the depth of what was lost, so that the damage is remembered not as a distant tragedy, but as a lesson carried forward through time. The story of the transatlantic trade does not end with the closing of ports or the abolition of ships. Its weight lingers, woven into the very fabric of the modern world. The legacies of those centuries are visible in the lives we lead today, in the divisions that persist, in the struggles that continue, and in the voices that rise to demand justice. The past has not vanished, it has shaped the present. Across the globe, societies still feel the imprint of this history. In many places, inequality is not simply the result of chance but the inheritance of systems built long ago. Communities descended from those who endured the trade often face obstacles rooted in that history, whether in access to education, opportunities for prosperity, or fair treatment under the law. These disparities are not accidents, they are echoes of a system that once sought to value profit over humanity. The structures created during those centuries have proven stubborn. From economic hierarchies to cultural prejudices, the patterns established by the trade continue to influence how societies operate. They appear in subtle forms as well as invisible barriers, reminding us that the legacies of the past are not confined to history books but are lived experiences for millions of people. And yet, where there is oppression, there has always been resistance. Today, movements across the world call for remembrance, recognition, and change. People gather to honor ancestors who endured, to demand that their stories be told truthfully, and to insist that justice be pursued. These calls are not about reopening old wounds but about acknowledging them so that healing can begin. Remembrance plays a crucial role. Monuments, ceremonies, and stories bring to light what was once silenced. Every retelling ensures that the voices lost in the waves are not forgotten. Through remembrance, societies have the chance to confront uncomfortable truths and to build bridges toward a more equitable future. To remember is not merely to look back, it is to choose to shape the present with honesty. Justice, too, remains a powerful theme. It is sought not only in legal reforms or political promises but in the recognition of shared humanity. Justice means dismantling the systems that continue to perpetuate inequality. It means ensuring that future generations grow up in a world where their worth is not measured by the shadows of history but by their own potential. The legacy of the trade is heavy, but it is also instructive. It shows us the dangers of allowing greed and power to outweigh compassion. It reminds us that silence in the face of injustice allows wounds to deepen. But it also reveals the resilience of those who endured, whose cultures and traditions survived against overwhelming odds. Their strength laid the foundation for future generations to rise, to resist, and to demand a world shaped by dignity and equality. As we close this story, let us not see it as distant history but as a mirror reflecting our own time. The ocean that once carried ships still carries their memory, and the societies built on their cargo still carry their consequences. The task before us is to learn, to remember, and to act, so that the injustices of the past do not define the future. If you found this story meaningful, I invite you to support this channel by liking this video, subscribing for more history brought to life, and sharing it with others who value the power of remembrance. Together, we can keep these stories alive, not as relics of the past, but as lessons for today. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, and have a peaceful night's rest.